The Varnikai royal ship Shavok was almost a mile long, floating quietly in space above the moon planet Uxin 6. Inside, its shiny halls of white metal and blue lights were filled with diplomats speaking politely, soldiers marching in perfect lines, and old traditions being carried out. James Nolan didn't care about any of that. It was 2 a.m. on the ship. James had a mop in his hand, a sore back, and one goal: finish cleaning before his third cup of warm stale coffee wore off. He wasn't a soldier or a diplomat or even a scientist. He was a janitor, hired through an interspecies work program and sent off 6 months ago to do light maintenance on starships. In reality, that meant scrubbing weird alien goo off ceilings and trying to vacuum glowing dust that sometimes tried to bite him. He was exhausted. His right knee made a popping sound every few steps. His left wrist hurt from weeks of nonstop mopping, and the floor cleaner the Varnikai used was thick like slime and smelled like burnt rubber. Tonight had pushed him over the edge. He had just finished disinfecting an entire hall of ceremonial pods that reeked of sulfur and incense. His gloves were disintegrating at the fingertips, his eyes stung, and his cleaning drone had stopped responding for no discernible reason. Again. So when he finally reached the sealed chamber marked Sanctum of the One Mind Seat and found that someone had tracked gunk across the freshly sanitized floor, big, wet, shiny footprints all the way to the center, he lost it. He grumbled something unrepeatable, yanked the mop off the wall unit, and stormed in. The chamber was quiet, bathed in low blue lighting. Ancient symbols spiraled up the curved walls, and in the center sat the object of his future infamy, a large, ornate, spine-covered chair made of obsidian and gold. It looked like it was designed by someone who'd never seen a chair but had strong feelings about spikes. James didn't know it, but this was the ceremonial throne of the Varnikai high lineage. Untouched by mortal hands for over 400 years, it was considered sacred, cursed, and deeply tied to the Empire's oldest rite, the lineal ascension. All James knew was that the weird chair was blocking his mopping path. "Of course," he muttered, "just leave your creepy furniture in the middle of the floor. That's fine." But he kicked it. Not hard. More of a frustrated shove with his boot. He meant to nudge it aside. What happened instead was a deafening hum, like a massive tuning fork vibrating inside his skull. Lights along the walls flared, a gust of air shot through the room, and the throne shuddered, then slowly rotated toward him. James stumbled back, wide-eyed. The spikes along the chair's rim folded inward, revealing a glowing crest. A symbol etched itself into the floor beneath him in radiant silver. Then came the voice, booming from the chamber's hidden speakers. Challenger recognized. Ascension protocol engaged. James blinked. What? Doors slammed shut. Emergency runes ignited around the chamber. Security sirens didn't scream so much as sing in a chilling harmonic chorus. The throne extended a hand-shaped panel. James took a shaky step back. "Oh no. No. I'm not. Look, I was just mopping, okay? I'm maintenance. I fix coffee machines and clean alien toilets." But the chamber didn't care. Biometric lock confirmed. Cognition alignment in progress. Somewhere on a balcony above, an unseen observer whispered. He activated it. He actually activated the One Mind seat. Security arrived fast. Not the ship's usual officers, but ceremonial guards in reflective armor that rippled like liquid metal. James stood with his hands up, rambling explanations as they surrounded him. "I didn't mean to. I didn't even sit on it. Listen, if this is some kind of royal thing, I can leave. No need to point the stabby end at me." A voice broke through the tension. Sharp. Authority dripping from every syllable. "Stand down." The guards froze, then parted. A tall, four-eyed Varnikai noble stepped forward. He wore a crimson sash and a gaze sharp enough to cut steel. Behind him trailed a smaller figure, a female aide holding a tablet, her expression caught between horror and fascination. The noble spoke again. "You touched the throne?" James hesitated. "I kicked it," the aide gasped. The noble looked at the glowing floor glyphs, then at the throne, which was still humming faintly. "Then it has begun." James frowned. "What has—" "The right of the empty seat, the coronation ritual. You are now a contestant in the trial of worth." James stared at him. "I'm a janitor." "And now," the noble said, turning to leave, "you are a contender for the crown." Later, in a holding chamber that was far too comfortable for someone being detained, James sat on a wide couch, his hands wrapped around a warm hydration pod that pulsed softly. Across from him, the female aide, who had introduced herself as Minari, explained the situation. "The throne cannot be activated accidentally. It recognizes willpower, frustration, and alignment with leadership traits embedded in our ancient codes. You kicked it. The system scanned your intent and found it. Sufficient." "That's ridiculous," James muttered. "I was just mad." Minari nodded solemnly. "Many great rulers begin in anger. What matters is what comes after." James slouched back. "What comes after, apparently, is I get hunted by alien nobility because I clean too close to the sacred furniture." She didn't deny it. "The trials will begin in 3 days. You will be summoned. You may refuse, but doing so publicly marks you as a coward in lineage and can result in exile or ritual challenge from others." James laughed, then saw she wasn't joking. "Oh, you're serious? I suggest you train." "Train for what?" "The trials test intellect, courage, adaptability, and combat readiness. They will not be easy." James stared at his hands. Calloused, dirty, fingers still stained from the sulfur pod room. "This is insane." "It is," Minari agreed, "but it's also happening." The next day, James woke in a private chamber, stocked with basic training gear and a medical pod. His first attempt at exercise was brief. He lasted 6 minutes on the Varnikai orbital treadmill before twisting his ankle and pulling a hamstring. The med pod hissed as it scanned him, listing minor tears, inflammation, and sleep deprivation markers. "You are unfit for combat," the pod announced with sterile cheer. "Yeah," James muttered. "No kidding." But he didn't stop. He learned to navigate the zero-gravity obstacle course. Badly. He practiced basic alien etiquette with Minari, tripping over half the ceremonial phrases. He read about Varnikai noble customs, trial precedents, and the ancient rite known as the Flame of Challenge, where one trial involved fighting blindfolded inside a chamber full of noise mimics. And every night, he stared at the image of the throne, trying to understand why it had reacted to him. "Still think it made a mistake?" Minari asked once, watching him from the doorway. James didn't answer. But part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, something in him had wanted to be seen. Not as a janitor, but as someone who mattered. James Nolan never intended to become a symbol of anything, let alone an imperial wildcard, but 3 days after the throne incident, he stood barefoot in a high-gravity dome, soaked in sweat, heart hammering as a Varnikai warrior twice his size circled him. "This is the first of 4 trials," announced the officiant, his voice reverberating through the arena. "Trial of balance. The path of leadership begins with inner weight." James wasn't sure what that meant, but judging by the 10-foot spinning obstacle between him and the platform exit, it had something to do with staying on his feet. The Varnikai opponent, a female named Eshka, lunged with controlled force. She was not trying to kill him, that much had been explained. These trials weren't about death, they were about proving intent and presence, what the Varnikai called the pulse of direction. Still, getting slammed off the rotating platform counted as failure. James sidestepped, barely dodging the sweep of her long tail, but his right leg gave out slightly. His ankle, already taped from last week's treadmill debacle, twinged hard. He gritted his teeth. Eshka struck again, and this time he didn't dodge. He dropped, let her miss over his head. She overcompensated, and James rolled under her legs, making it 3 paces toward the pedestal. He didn't look back. He climbed. By the time he reached the summit, breathless and shaking, Eshka was kneeling at the base, her head bowed in formal submission, not to him, but to the process. The officiant's voice rang out. Trial 1 complete, worth confirmed. Minari met him just beyond the gates, eyes wide. You won. James limped forward. I didn't fall off. I didn't die. Let's call that winning. His right leg swelled badly that evening. The onboard medical unit confirmed he'd strained a ligament, exacerbating the previous injury. No combat for 72 hours, the system warned. Too bad the schedule doesn't care, James muttered as he applied the cryo wrap Minari handed him. You could withdraw, she said. He didn't answer. Trial 2 was not physical, it was worse. The Chamber of Illusions was a psychological maze. Over 20 corridors, each filled with scenarios designed to manipulate, confuse, or emotionally destabilize the participant. No weapons, no time limit. Just survive and make it to the end without succumbing to panic or aggression. James hesitated outside the chamber's gate. A medic had retaped his knee, wrapped his torso to support a minor rib strain he hadn't even noticed, and warned him not to overexert. Inside, he faced doors that whispered his name, pathways that looped him back to the beginning, an entire section flooded with the scent of his childhood kitchen, which was so out of place it brought tears to his eyes. At one point, a projection of his father appeared, or rather, what his father might have looked like if he hadn't disappeared before James turned 10. It asked him why he was wasting his time trying to be more than a janitor. James stood there for 10 full minutes, not crying, not yelling, just breathing. Then he walked past it. Later, he encountered a bleeding child curled in a corner, crying for help. When he tried to lift her, she dissolved into fog and echoed his mother's voice. Not everything is yours to fix. James stumbled through the final door 3 hours later, mentally exhausted, eyes dry, throat sore from clenching every emotion inside. Trial 2 passed. They didn't cheer. Varnikai didn't believe in loud victories. But the nods he received from observers meant more than any applause. By the time the third trial arrived, James had become a topic of contention across the ship. Some nobles whispered he was a cosmic fluke. Others, especially younger warriors, saw him as something else entirely, proof that worthiness wasn't limited to bloodlines. He didn't feel worthy. He felt like he was barely keeping himself upright. Trial 3 was known as the Path of Fire. Not literal flame, it was a challenge of endurance and trust. James and 2 other challengers, an exiled Varnikai prince and a mercenary from the Outer Moons, were dropped into a vast labyrinth with dwindling oxygen, no map, and one shared tool between them, a beacon emitter that could guide them out. But only if used by someone who stayed behind. You must decide, the officiant said, who leaves, who lingers, who is willing to fade so others rise. They had 5 hours. For 2, they argued. The mercenary, Kalos, wanted to split up and try their luck. The prince refused, quoting the sacred codes about shared burden. James sat against a wall, knee wrapped, ribs burning, and quietly listened. At hour 3, the beacon blinked. Low charge. At hour 4, Kalos tried to snatch it and run. James didn't stop him. He tackled him. It hurt. His ribs screamed. His shoulder popped and reseated itself painfully. But Kalos dropped the beacon. The prince retrieved it, looked at James, who was curled on the floor, panting, left arm clutched tight to his side. I'll stay, James said hoarsely. I'm the slow one anyway. The prince looked down at him for a long time, then placed the beacon in James's lap. No, you lit the path. They left him in the dim hallway. He leaned back against the cold wall, watching the beacon glow faintly. It was still glowing when the walls parted 2 hours later, and trial wardens pulled him out. You were not meant to stay, one said. I wasn't meant to do any of this, James muttered. But Here we are. His left shoulder was partially dislocated, the joint capsule had swollen, and the surrounding musculature showed early signs of strain. The med unit prescribed immobilization, pain management, and 2 days of rest. He took one, because the final trial was coming. And it wasn't optional. The trial of lineage. Not a battle, not a maze. It was a debate. In the great chamber of Varnikai history, under murals painted with stardust and ceremonial blood, James stood before the high circle. 11 nobles, all armed with questions. You have no lineage, one said, no claim, no name of worth. Just a mop, another added, and nerve. Where do you think you can lead? James didn't try to bluff. I don't. They blinked. But I didn't come here trying to take something. I came here doing a job. I respected your walls. I cleaned your floors. I saw what people ignored. He looked at each of them. You want to know if I can lead? I can't promise power. I can't promise vision. But I can promise that I know how to work. I know how to get up when I'm hurt. And I know that thrones are just chairs until someone fills them with purpose. There was a long silence. Then a bell rang. Final trial passed. 2 days later, the coronation began. It was not a celebration. It was a confirmation. The throne room filled with Varnikai nobles, warriors, scholars. Even Minari's face was solemn as she approached James, who wore a tunic lined in silver and held a ceremonial rod of grounding. You could still refuse, she said quietly. James looked at the throne. I kicked it. Then sit, she said. He stepped forward, sat. The throne pulsed once, softly. Not in pain. In recognition. A new leader. Unexpected. Unwanted by many. But chosen. James Nolan sat in the throne of the one mind. Back straight, feet planted, left shoulder still partially immobilized beneath ceremonial robes that fit awkwardly. The chamber was deathly quiet. The Varnikai nobility lined the balcony above him, their gaze unreadable. There had been no applause, no chants, no glorious music. This was the Varnikai way. When the throne accepted a ruler, it needed no spectacle. James swallowed hard. The golden crown crest, really more of a neural circlet, pressed lightly against his forehead. It didn't glow, it pulsed, a soft, steady beat, in sync with his own heart. His pulse quickened under its touch, not from fear, but from the growing weight of what he had agreed to. Minari stood off to the side, holding a datapad and wearing her usual calm. You don't need to make a speech, she said gently. Don't have one, James muttered, unless you count. Oops. She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. He looked at the gathering again. They're all hoping I'll say I made a mistake, that I'll step down. Minari's tone turned quiet. Some are, others are watching to see if you prove it wasn't. James exhaled slowly. The pain in his ribs was a dull burn now. His shoulder still throbbed with every movement, but the inflammation had begun to drop. He could at least lift a glass now without gritting his teeth, not that he'd had time to. In the days following the coronation, he'd been thrust into diplomatic briefings, constitutional readings, and ceremonial consultations. The more he learned about the Varnikai Empire, the more he realized just how deep the rot went. Centuries of ceremonial leadership had calcified real governance. Nobles feuded over titles, not reforms. Trade stagnated under archaic treaty rituals. Colonies on outer planets starved because protocols required proper lineage channels to approve emergency relief. James hadn't known what he was getting into, but now he did, and he was furious. It started with a chair. Fitting. At the first council assembly after the coronation, James entered the Hall of Memory carrying something unusual. A metal folding stool. He set it beside the throne and sat in it instead. The nobles murmured. Is this a statement? One asked, sharp and offended. Yes, James said. It means the chair doesn't make the leader, action does. Some scoffed. Others leaned in. James motioned to Minari, who handed out reports, real ones. Colony supply metrics, emergency beacon data, trade route failures. I didn't go through your trials just to be a symbol, he said. So here's what we're going to do. I want medical drones dispatched to Yithar Station within 24 hours. I want water reclamation tech redirected to Reval 8, and I want a complete audit of ceremonial funds from the last 10 cycles. The room exploded with voices. You have no authority to demand sitting in the seat. That does not give you... The throne does, Minari cut in. Everyone froze. She held up a small device, a recording from the moment James was seated. The throne had pulsed and spoken in Varnikai tones so old they were barely translatable. He who sits with intention may command the blooded line. James sat in the folding chair, arms crossed, watching the room fall quiet. Now, he said, let's start acting like an empire worth saving. His reforms were not met with applause. He was challenged. Legally, symbolically, once, even physically, an ambassador from the Ninth House demanded a combat-based leadership reassessment, a loophole still present in ancient code. James accepted. The fight was scheduled to last until submission. It lasted 7 seconds. James didn't win through strength. He ducked the ambassador's first swing, tripped him with his left foot, and applied a maneuver he'd once learned from a security video on bar fights. The ambassador tapped out with a dislocated elbow. James popped his own shoulder again in the process. The medical team was not thrilled. You re-aggravated a healing capsule, Dr. Nursa growled. Do you even want to use your left arm again? I'm right-handed, James said, teeth clenched as she applied regeneration foam. That's not the point. I know, he muttered. I'm just tired of everyone testing if I belong. She wrapped his arm with tight support mesh and leaned in. Then stop making them ask. Weeks passed. Slowly, change took root. James refused royal transport. He rode public shuttles. He visited mining stations with no media presence. He held open forums and listened without scripts. The Empire whispered. Not all support was loud, not all opposition was overt. But momentum grew. He created the first Council of the Unblooded, a legislative subbody made up of workers, educators, transport pilots. It had no formal authority, until colonies started obeying it more than the nobility. When questioned about legitimacy, James pointed back to the throne's ancient inscription, "Worth is proven in weight carried, not names etched." Some nobles plotted to unseat him through constitutional referendum. They failed. Barely. One tried to poison him. James spent 3 days in the medbay, vomiting blood and hallucinating desert moons. The toxin was rare, but not lethal, with early treatment. His recovery was slow. He couldn't stand for more than a minute the first day out. His system took 10 more to purge fully. Minari stayed beside him through it all. You could walk away, she said once. He shook his head. Not until the job's done. You don't owe this empire anything. James looked at her, eyes sunken but focused. I owe it a shot. If I can fix what got me here, maybe it means something. It wasn't a single moment that changed everything. It was the 4th food convoy landing on Reval 8, the first satellite school opening in the Outer Rim. The young Varnikai, who quoted James in her trial speech, saying the throne didn't choose blood, it chose effort. It was Minari, smiling when he didn't notice, watching him finally sit in the actual throne again. Not because he needed to, because he'd earned it. On the 100th day of his reign, James Nolan stood in the throne chamber once more. Cleaned, polished, no longer sacred and untouchable. Just a room. He walked slowly now, the injuries never fully left. His shoulder ached in the morning, his ribs had a permanent tenderness. He limped when tired. He saw a physiotech twice a week and wore compression gear under his robe. But he stood taller than the day he kicked the throne. He looked around at the gathered crowd, diplomats, workers, children, then at Minari. Then he stepped forward and sat. The throne pulsed, and the Varnikai Empire, for the first time in living memory, didn't just follow. Ed believed. 3 months after the throne first activated under James Nolan's foot, the Varnikai Empire's central citadel prepared for what it called the Day of Reflection. It was not a festival, it was not a ceremony, it was a ritual of governance review, an ancient tradition where the empire paused to evaluate the path of its leadership. No ruler had taken it seriously for over 200 years. James took it personally. He didn't prepare by writing speeches or rehearsing symbolic gestures. He prepared by gathering data, listening to reports, and spending a full night sitting at a community center on Torsen Ridge, where construction crews had requested better conditions and faster medical support for injury triage. He asked questions, took notes, got yelled at, and still showed up at dawn the next day for the official review. The council hall was packed with nobles, advisors, civic representatives, and a few reluctantly included outer colony delegates. James stood alone at the center. He was wearing a uniform that wasn't imperial, plain charcoal gray with a collar slightly frayed on one edge. His only adornment was the simple neural circlet resting lightly above his brow. He hadn't replaced it with gold. The first counselor rose. "You were not born here," she said. "You have no family on record. You were not trained. You have sustained 5 injuries since your coronation. You refuse the privileges offered, and you still do not sleep in the palace." "I'm told the embassy beds are firmer," James said simply. A few chuckles flickered, quickly swallowed. The counselor gestured broadly. "You have acted, boldly, but without permission, without tradition, without precedent." James looked across the room, faces stiff, tired, curious, angry, hopeful. "I came into this by accident," he said, "but I stayed on purpose." He took a slow breath. His ribs didn't hurt anymore, but the memory of pain still made him careful. "I'm not from here. I don't have a royal name. I wasn't raised to lead. But I know what it feels like to be ignored, to be tired, to want things to be better and not know how to make it happen." He turned slightly, letting his voice fill the room. "Since I've taken the throne, 38 neglected trade agreements have been resolved. 15 outer colonies have restored their medical infrastructure. Food convoys have reached the outer moons for the first time in 3 cycles. That wasn't me, that was people already trying. People who just needed someone to stop getting in their way." He paused, then added, "And yes, I've made mistakes. I aggravated old injuries. I overruled too quickly. I skipped steps." He looked at the counselor directly. "But I've shown up. Every single day." She sat down. The chamber held its breath. Then an old transport mechanic from Balar 3, one of the new delegates, stood. No ceremony, no rank, just a tired man in a patched flight suit. "My station used to get maybe 1 supply drop a year, always late, always short." He looked at James. "This one came in person. Didn't bring a camera, didn't give a speech. Just sat with my crew while we dug out damaged equipment. He got frostbite in his hands because he wouldn't put gloves on over oil-stained bandages. And I don't care if that's not tradition. That's leadership." No one interrupted him. When he sat down, the silence was softer. James stepped forward again. "I'm not trying to erase your culture. I'm not trying to break the system. I'm trying to wake it up." The youngest noble on the council, the one who had supported him quietly for weeks, stood and said, "Then what happens if we vote to replace you?" James didn't flinch. "Then I go back to cleaning ships. I'll still work. I'll still help. I don't need the throne to keep trying." That answer stayed in the room even after the vote. It was unanimous. He stayed. That night, James returned to the palace, not to celebrate, but because Minari told him to. He led him through a quiet corridor, past old murals, and into a room he hadn't seen before. Inside was a chair, not the throne, just a worn, unremarkable wooden chair. scuffed, repaired, real. It had been pulled from the original construction station, where the first Varnikai Leadership Council had gathered nearly 1,000 years ago. Lay beneath the thick layers of ice they sat here, Minari said. Not to rule, just to talk. James sat slowly. His shoulder didn't hurt anymore. Not in that moment. You started all this by kicking a chair, she said, smiling faintly. Maybe it's fitting you end today in one. He looked at her. You stayed through all of it. I saw the throne choose you, she said. And then I watched you choose to stay. That matters more. He nodded. The quiet sat comfortably between them. Then he said, You ever think we're just making it up as we go? All the time, she replied. The difference is, you clean up after yourself. By the end of that cycle, James Nolan's name became a part of Varnikai records, not as emperor, not as ruler, as steward. First leader ever to request the title change formally. He didn't build a legacy from strength. He didn't hold power with fear. He worked, he listened, he limped, he showed up even when it hurt. He turned a throne back into a chair, and reminded an empire that being chosen doesn't matter nearly as much as choosing to be better.